Okay, today we're going to talk about another important population interaction. This is called predation. Normally, when we think of predation, we think of carnivory, where you've got some type of active searching predator going out and looking for prey, such as a lion seeking out gazelle or wildebeest on a savanna, African savanna. And then you've got sit and wait predators. Those would be the predators that more likely would be waiting for something to come along and maybe even camouflaging itself, such as the spots on a leopard is a predator camouflaging itself to, be able to surprise a prey. Cannibalism is another act of predation. Siblicide is something that's commonly practiced by birds of prey. A lot of birds of prey will lay 2 eggs. Most cases, they will incubate 1 egg when it's laid, right after it's laid. In other words, they have what's called asynchronous hatching. So they'll lay 1 egg on one day, and then maybe 2 days later, they'll lay another egg. So that 1 egg that they've laid earlier gets kind of a head start on incubation. So that means that nestling will hatch out of that egg earlier. So it'll be older and larger in size compared to the second nestling. So in good ecological years, when there's an adequate food supply, and the parents are being able to bring adequate food to allow both offspring to survive. But in bad ecological years, what happens is that older nestling not getting enough food, so it will actually consume the second nestling, providing it with enough nutrients to continue to survive. And then, of course, it's going to get what little food that the parents bring. But at least it ensures that it survives and gets out of the nest and continues on. So that practice of what's called siblicide in birds of prey at least ensures 1 offspring gets out of the nest. But in good years, both offspring survive and are able to fledge from the nest. Normally, we don't. I suspect normally most people probably don't think of herbivory as being predation, but certainly it has to be considered to be an act of predation because an herbivore is essentially preying upon a plant, even though it doesn't normally kill the plant, I suspect. Well, some herbivores probably do, but if you're thinking in terms of a cow grazing on grass, it's only clipping off the surface layer, so it's still going to continue to grow. So not all herbivores are killing their plant that they're consuming, but nevertheless, it's still considered to be kind of an act of predation. A parasitoid is a unique example of predation. A parasitoid is kind of the mix between a predator and a parasite. A large number of species of wasps are actually parasitoids as larval stages. The adult is free living, but the larva is a parasitoid. So what they'll do is that the adult female will lay her eggs on another insect. Those eggs will hatch. The larva will penetrate the body of that insect, and they will feed from the inside, and eventually killing that host or that prey. And so it kind of acts like the cross between a parasite and a predator. The effects of predators on distribution, not only of the predator but also of the prey. You have to think in terms that a predator is only going to be found wherever there's adequate prey. So it's going to affect the distribution not only of the predator but also possibly driving the prey out of an area. Prey may emigrate out of an area as a result of the heavy effects of predation. Also can affect abundance. Predators are going to affect the abundance of prey. The more predators consume the prey, their populations are going to start to decline. As their populations decline, so does the predator populations. The more prey there is, the more predators there are, because they can increase their numbers, and it has a profound impact on their fecundity. Competition. Think in terms of a predator switching prey items simply because there are other predators that are also feeding on that prey, reducing its numbers, and they've got to be sort of be forced to switch to a more abundant prey item. Or you might have a predator that's a much more efficient predator on a particular prey, and then out-competing one predator for access to prey because it simply is better at capturing them. So competition certainly can be factored into understanding predator-prey interactions. All right, we'll move on to the next slide. And this is an example of a classical study but done by Gause in 1934. He took these test tubes in which he placed a predator and the predator being Didinium, the prey being Paramecium, and a food medium for the Paramecium, which is bacteria. What he discovered is that over time the predator simply out-eat its food supply, and then the predator, not only did the prey become extinct, when it became extinct, now the predator didn't have anything to eat, and then eventually it becomes extinct. When he placed a sediment into the test tube, allowing a refuge for Paramecium to escape predation, what's going to happen is that the predator will eat what Paramecium that it can find, and then eventually, not able to supply itself with adequate food, will start to decline and eventually crash, become extinct. And now what Paramecium are hiding within the sediment, it will increase their populations and eventually will start to increase. Only when he placed a active system of immigration into the test tube by, say, every other day or so, he would place a Paramecium in the test tube and a Didinium in the test tube, was he able to get an oscillating population curve indicated. So by adding a refuge for the Paramecium or the prey to escape predation, and by adding immigration into the system, then we are able to see an oscillating predator-prey population. This oscillating predator-prey situation here between the populations can also be further discussed with regards to understanding a little bit about how the numbers affect each other in terms of predator-prey. So if you got a prey population that's going to, say, increase over time, which again is going to be related to their food source. They don't have adequate food, and their population numbers are not going to increase. But let's say that the prey population increases. The predator is going to respond to that because there's more food now for the predator population, not only to feed themselves, but also to feed their offspring. It also is going to have a profound impact on their ability to survive. So that allows their fecundity to increase. Predators respond as there's more food in their population numbers now. It's going to place a significant amount of pressure on the prey population simply because there's more predators. What's going to happen next is they're going to cause a decline in the prey population. So now, as there's less prey, the predators responds by, again, less food for them, has a profound impact on their ability to survive, has a profound impact on their ability to reproduce, sort of removing the predator pressure on the prey. Now the prey can start recovering, start reproducing more. Predator now kind of lagging behind the prey population, but as the prey population then begins to increase, they can now start increasing in number, and that is the predator populations will start to recover. So this cyclic pathway is in response to the numbers of predator and prey and how they kind of interact to affect the overall oscillation of both predator and prey populations. This oscillation pattern has been studied many times, and one good example illustrating the oscillating predator-prey populations goes back to a study study that essentially looked at the number of skins that were brought in by fur bearers over a 75-year period. And you can see from the oscillating pattern between the snowshoe hare, the prey, and the predator being the lynx, there's a distinct oscillation with the prey, or I should say the predator, lagging slightly behind the prey, just like in the previous example that I discussed. And so this oscillation is something that we see is a definite phenomenon that's occurring between predator and prey. All right, this next example illustrates a phenomena that was introduced by Halling in 1959, And this is what is referred to as the functional response of predator associated with increasing prey density. The functional response essentially is how the predator is able to handle prey with their increasing density. And there's three types of responses that Holling described. The first one is really probably more theoretical than anything. Type 1 functional response shows a linear increase with regards to the number of prey that are going to be taken by the predator over time. So prey density on the x-axis, the number of prey eaten per predator on the y-axis, and so you have a linear increase with the number of prey over time being taken by the predator. So the type 1 functional response, probably more or less a theoretical way that we can kind of view this so-called functional response. I guess maybe a good example of a type 1 functional response might be if you had a bunch of mayfly eggs in, say, a lake or a pond that all hatched at the same time, and you got trout in there feeding, they would all start feeding on those mayflies, and you get this linear response occurring. So that might be kind of an example of how that type 1 response might be applied. All right, the type 2 response indicated here factors in something called handling time into the equation. So at low prey density, at low prey densities, not many prey obviously for the predator to handle, but as prey density starts to increase, we're factoring in the phenomena of what's called handling time. And by handling time, I'm talking about chasing, killing, and eating and digesting prey. All of those are factored into handling. So at higher prey density, notice that the curve is going to start to level off, simply because it's going to require more handling time, and so that's going to cause the number of prey taken to level off and finally reach an asymptote. You're just not going to be able to handle, all that. When you get to high prey density, you're simply not going to be able to handle them all, and so you're going to reach an asymptote as a result of that. So I'd say probably the type 2 curve is probably more applicable to invertebrate predators than anything else. The type 3 curve, indicated here by the blue line, kind of factors in another thing besides handling time. It also factors in what's called search time. Search time could be thought of in terms of how much time it takes for a predator to not only recognize what is prey, but also be able to focus in on that prey using its eyes or its sight to be able to try to capture it. So at very low prey density, you got to spend a lot more time searching, and so you got a lag in the curve here. But as prey density starts to increase, notice the curve picks up because now I focused on the prey density. There's more prey to focus on, so now more numbers are going to be taken, and the curve is going to increase. The curve is going to level off here, once again, because I factored in handling time. Because, as you get to higher prey density, you're just simply not going to be able to handle them all, and so you're going to eventually reach an asymptote. All right, moving on to the next slide, which indicates another important response, and this kind of goes back to my previous discussion when I talked about predator-prey oscillations. The numerical response is how the predator is going to increase in number again as a result of prey population. The more food there is, the more survivorship in the predator means they can grow at a faster rate. They can reproduce earlier, increasing their overall fecundity, especially if they produce a large number of females. And again, remember when we talked about population ecology, I mentioned the growth rate, which is R. So you get a significant amount of growth as a result of producing more females, and so the population is going to increase, and that is the numerical response. You could also factor in kind of a subcategory here called the aggregative response, which is essentially where predators will aggregate to an area where there's a higher prey density. So an aggregative response could be factored in here, and I guess you could kind of consider that to be a subcategory of the numerical response. All right, now moving on to what we'll define as what's called keystone predation. A keystone species or a keystone predator is a predator that is a keystone in the environment. If I remove the predator, which is the keystone, then this entire column is going to collapse, which means the collapse in the number of species that can occur in that area, because the predator has a profound impact on community structure. A good example of this was a classic study done by Robert Payne back in the 1960s. What Payne did was he walked around these tidal pools in Washington State, and he did an experiment, and did this over a 6-year period, where he removed the starfish disaster, which is a predator, from the tidal pools in some areas, and then he left them in other areas. So where they were left, that's kind of the control. Where he removed them, that's kind of the experimental design. So where they were left, that's the control. He found that the number of species remained relatively stable. But when he removed them, he found that their populations, in other words, the number of species within those tidal pools, began to significantly crash. So what he discovered was that disaster was a key predator, particularly in affecting the mitolus mussel, which actually was a better competitor for the limited resource of space. So this mussel outcompeted all of these other species for space when the predator was removed, kept its populations, or rather I should say, when the predator is removed, the mitolus populations began to increase to essentially affect the number of species. So the fact that the predator is there, that is the disaster starfish is there, kept the populations low enough so that it would not, that is, mitolus would not outcompete the other species for space. So biodiversity was significantly impacted as a result of the presence or absence of the predator in this case. All right, so another example of this would be the sea otter in kelp communities. Sea otters are have a significant impact on the presence of kelp because the sea otter is a predator on the sea urchin. If you remove the sea otter, the sea urchins then feed upon the kelp, reducing the kelp forest and ultimately having a profound impact on the biodiversity of the community, because the kelp essentially becomes food for other organisms as well as a refuge or an important habitat. So once again, the keystone is or rather I should say the sea otter is an important keystone predator on sea urchins and thus affecting the kelp communities. Keep in mind though that a keystone species doesn't always necessarily have to be a predator. There are a lot of species that are keystones, and certainly beavers are keystones, are a keystone species because beaver dams essentially increase a lot of little microhabitats for a wide variety of organisms to subsist. So do prairie dogs, prairie dog towns. There are a lot of different kinds of vertebrate animals that are associated with prairie dogs. The only place, for example, that you're going to find a burrowing owl is in a prairie dog community. And there are a lot of other organisms. Normally when we think of wolves, which is of course a very important predator, when they were removed in certain areas as a result of overhunting, it increased deer populations, which led to overgrazing, and ultimately that had a profound impact on forest structure. While certainly wolves are a predator, I just want to emphasize from this slide that a keystone species isn't always a predator. It could be, some other kind of important species that has some profound impact on the environment in a way that is going to affect other species, and it's going to, have a profound impact on the biodiversity within a given area. All right, now we're going to move into and discuss the concept of optimal foraging theory. What I have written here on this slide is kind of a brief overview of optimal foraging theory. It's far more complex than what is illustrated here. But I just want to point out that a predator wants to maximize, one of the main things about optimal foraging is that a predator wants to maximize its return, that is its caloric intake, as it consumes prey, maximize its return on the investment that it puts forth in order to find that prey. So by investment, I'm talking about searching, capturing, and consuming prey. All of those things that I just mentioned have a profound impact on how much energy you're going to expend. So if prey items or a particular prey is not going to be very abundant or is not very nutritious enough to allow you to subsist, then you've got to be able to switch to another prey item. Switching from one prey item to another might not necessarily always be associated with caloric intake. Some species, some prey are simply, they're more nutritious, I guess, than other prey. It could be related to numbers. If one highly nutritious prey item simply starts to decline or its numbers are relatively rare, then the predator's got to switch to maybe has to switch to a less nutritious prey item simply because it's easier to find, and at least it will acquire some caloric intake to allow it to continue to survive. So while generalist predators probably don't have much of a profound impact on affecting prey densities, there are many examples of specialists that certainly can have a profound impact on prey numbers. But usually there's not really too many examples of predators that are really, really specialized on one prey item. Although, if you think in terms of herbivory, you're thinking about perhaps a koala feeding on eucalyptus. That certainly is going to affect, where that particular animal is going to be located and so forth. But in terms of carnivory, there's probably not too many examples of predators that are highly specialized. In most cases, they're going to switch from one prey item to another depending upon not only nutrition or caloric intake, but also how abundant the prey is. All right, so moving on now to discussion of coevolution. Just want to mention here, when you take a look at what's written here, understand that when the predator and prey are interacting and their populations are also oscillating, the oscillation is not just due to numerical responses and functional responses, as I talked about earlier, but is also due to a kind of a evolutionary strategy that's going to develop as a result of the predator preying upon the prey. So they each have to evolve ways to, in other words, the predator wants to maintain a close association with the prey, but the prey, on the other hand, wants to evolve ways to get out of that association, if you will, or ways to escape predators. So it is a kind of an arms race where predators have to be much more efficient at capturing prey. Prey, in turn, have to be much more efficient in being able to escape predators. So they each have to evolve by way of natural selection strategies to, predators evolving strategies to capture prey and prey evolving strategies to escape predators. But really, this is, you think in terms of the fact that I guess you could think in terms of how natural selection, when it's affecting this, is probably going to have a more profound impact on the prey than it is the predator, because when a predator is unsuccessful in capturing a prey, it just simply lost a meal. But when a prey is eaten by a predator or killed by a predator, then it's just simply lost its life. So the selection pressures are probably going to be higher on the prey species than it is the predator. So usually what you see in predation is that the predator probably is mostly going to get younger, sicker individuals, those individuals that are diseased or those individuals that are very young are more than likely going to be primarily what it's going to spend most of its time preying upon. The healthy individuals more than likely are probably going to escape more often than not. So again, as I said, natural selection is probably going to be it's probably going to have a more profound impact on the prey than it is the predator. Because when the prey is eaten or killed, it's lost its life and it cannot continue to reproduce. So certainly the selection pressures are going to be more profound on the prey than it is the predator. All right, so we're going to now move into talking a little bit about some anti-predator evolutionary strategies. A good example is chemical defenses. The bombardier beetle, which is shown in this PowerPoint slide, is an insect that has evolved an effective mechanism in its abdomen that it actually mixes chemicals and it produces a shotgun blast-like explosion of material out of its abdomen that can act to deter predation. So it's a very unique chemical evolutionary strategy that this particular species has evolved as a way to separate itself from the predator and ultimately escape predation. A lot of other examples here. The blister beetle is a species that produces a substance called cantharidin, and this usually leaks out of the ends of its, in between the joints of its legs. It's a phenomenon called reflex bleeding, and that cantharidin can act as a significant anti-predator deterrent because it makes them toxic. Another example would be the phenomena of what's called aposematic coloration as a way for a prey to advertise to a potential predator that, hey, I'm toxic. If you can try to consume me, then you might potentially die or something of that nature. The arrow poison frog that I've talked about before in the past is an example of a species of frog that consumes a wide variety of different types of insects that allows for it to generate a toxic substance called batrachotoxin. Primary predators on these frogs are going to be birds, and since birds can see color, and any bright coloration is kind of considered to be a warning coloration, that if a predator then comes in contact with that animal, becomes violently ill and survives, it's going to remember to stay away from that color, whenever it again is going out searching for prey. So they're going to stay away from that color because they will remember that it's associated with that violent reaction that they had. A monarch butterfly is another classic example. The orange and black coloration is a warning, once again, an aposematic warning coloration, warning potential bird predators that if you try to consume me, you're going to get violently ill. And in the example here, the blue jay consumes a monarch, throws up, and I can assure you the next time it will remember that, anything that's a black and orange color is probably going to want to stay away from. So it works pretty effectively as a predator deterrent. Other predator deterrent strategies that prey evolve, again, that whole discussion earlier of the coevolutionary arms race. A prey could evolve in means of effective camouflage. I don't know if you can see this or not, but there's a moth here. This could be a good example of the, kind of like we talked about the peppered moth in our discussion of evolutionary ecology, and how this moth has evolved the effective way of camouflaging itself when it's landed on a tree. So no bird's going to be able to see that. Another example over here is the wolf spider on the sandy background. You can see the legs here. There's the cephalothorax, and there's the abdomen, so it's going to blend in extremely well and be very well camouflaged from predators. Another example would be and this is a rocky environment, and up here at the top, you kind of see a head right there. That's the pica. Remember, that's a rabbit-like mammal that is found around those types of habitats, and obviously would be very well camouflaged. Over here you got a long twig. You can barely see the outline of the body of a lizard. There's the head, leg, and then the tail right here. Very well camouflaged because, of course, it looks much like the branch there. All right. There are other examples. throw in a few things like disruptive coloration is where you would have some type of patterning across the surface of the body which breaks up the outline of the animal. For example, a zebra, it's got those stripes, breaks up the anterior end from the posterior end. Again, if you're a predator, you want to be able to attack from behind, but from far away, a zebra's got those stripes running across the body and kind of breaks up the outline of the animal, so it's kind of hard to pick out if you're a predator looking from far away. It's kind of hard to pick out, trying to determine what's the head and what's the tail. So if you can't determine what's the head and what's the tail, then you can't make a 6 o'clock attack on a prey species. All right, other examples. Here is an example of a phenomenon called Batesian mimicry. Batesian mimicry is where you have a model and a mimic. Okay, and a model would be we'll call it the distasteful species. Okay, the species that is, either poisonous or in some cases harmful in some way or another. Maybe it's a species that can, sting or is dangerous in some fashion. And then you've got the mimic here, which is evolving a similar color pattern. So if the mimic can evolve to look like the model, then it accrues itself an advantage, because if it looks like a distasteful species or an unpalatable species, then it's not going to be predated upon. So here you've got some rather interesting natural selective situations occurring where one species is evolving to look like another. In other words, it's accruing the advantage by looking like a distasteful species or potentially dangerous species. Monarch and viceroy was the classic example of this. The queen and the Arizona viceroy, which look a lot alike, are what have oftentimes been the classical example of Batesian mimicry. Other examples, as you can see here, the ladybug beetle, which is an aggressive species, and the Philippines cockroach is evolving to look like the aggressive species, and therefore predators will tend to stay away from it. Another classical example of Batesian is the many species of what are called milk snakes or certain king snake species, which will evolve a similar color pattern to look like the venomous coral snake. So if a milk snake, which is harmless, evolves a similar color pattern to a dangerous species, that will accrue it a selective advantage, and predators will then tend to stay away from it. And I think here, you can see certainly the differences in the color, but to a predator species, they probably wouldn't be able to pick out the subtle differences. But generally speaking, you can always tell a non-venomous milk snake from a venomous coral snake by looking at where the colors, which colors are actually bordering. So if it's red and black, the old saying goes, red and black, venom black, red and yellow will kill a fellow. So if the red and yellow lines are come in contact, then you're looking at a venomous coral snake. All right, so keep in mind, though, that the only way that this is going to evolve is that the model always has to outnumber the mimic. That's the only way it's going to evolve. That's the only way natural selection will allow it to evolve. Because if the mimic outnumbered the model, predators would then associate a color pattern with good to eat, and it would not be able to evolve. So once again, the only way this is going to evolve is if the model outnumbers the mimic. All right, so we're going to now, and just one other thing to mention here. Before I talk about going back to Batesian mimicry. Another type of important mimicry here is Mullerian mimicry, and this is an example of where you have multiple toxic, or I should say, many species of unpalatable organisms, or many species of dangerous organisms, all evolving the same color pattern. Because the more of them that evolve the same color pattern, the more of them there are in nature to influence predators, and therefore predators will then associate that particular color pattern with being distasteful or being potentially dangerous, and they'll stay away from it. So most of us know that wasps and bees typically are yellow and black or orange and black or one of those combinations. So if all or many wasps take on that same color pattern, birds will evolve the learning to stay away from that particular species. So they'll accrue a selective advantage. And of course, the many species of Helioconus butterflies all take on a distinctive color pattern. So while they all look alike, they're all different species, but they evolve the same color pattern because they're all distasteful, and that reinforces that in the predator population, and they will certainly stay away from it. All right, so the whole phenomena earlier about the Batesian mimicry, I mentioned that the viceroy and monarch has usually been the classical example of that. Further research has indicated that the viceroy-monarch situation is really not Batesian mimicry. It's actually an example of Mullerian mimicry. Because what they discovered is that the viceroy is just as distasteful as the Mullerian, or excuse me, just as distasteful as the monarch. So since they both take on a similar color pattern, then it would be more of an example of Mullerian mimicry rather than Batesian mimicry. All right, other examples, anti-predator strategies would be I mentioned the monarch butterfly being distasteful, and the reason why the monarch is distasteful is because it feeds on milkweed, one of the very few animals that can actually feed on milkweed. Very toxic plant material, and the milkweed is basically evolves enzymes that can allow it to feed on milkweed, but in turn it takes the cardiac glycoside, which is the toxic substance in milkweed, and incorporate that into its own tissues to make it self-toxic. So here you have a very unique evolutionary strategy that the monarch has evolved a way to effectively utilize a plant source that very few animals can utilize for food, but also incorporating the toxic materials that makes milkweed difficult for herbivores to consume, incorporating that toxic material, again, cardiac glycosides, into its own tissues to make it self-toxic. All right. Other strategies. Another important anti-predator strategy would be what's called predator satiation. Now, this occurs as a result of a prey species evolving, or I should say reproducing, or let me back up and say having a population explosion to completely overwhelm the predators. And a good example would be the 13-year cicada and the 17-year cicada. The 17-year cicada is a species that occurs up north. The 13-year cicada occurs down south. And what happens is they produce whenever they lay their eggs in the soil, the eggs develop into larvae, but the larvae will remain dormant for a long period of time. They will actually go through several instars, several different types of larval stages. And once they reach the last instar, then they will come out of the ground, and they'll all come out in mass. So whenever they come out in mass, so many of them completely overwhelm the predators. So many of them develop and emerge that they completely satiate or completely overwhelm the predators, and at least by that pathway, it ensures that a large number of them will, continue on and be able to escape predation, just simply by the fact that there's just so many of them. They just simply overwhelm the predator populations. But the reason why they call them 17-year and 13-year is because every 13 years is when you get this population explosion, because they have this cycle where if it's a 13-year cicada, they all develop at about the same time, and they all come out of the soil at the same time. And the same thing for the 17-year cicada. Every 13 years and every 17 years is when you have this phenomenal explosion of numbers, and you just simply overwhelm the predator populations, and they are unable to obviously capture them all, and so a large number of them will escape. All right, the next example of overcoming predation, in this case is referred to herbivory. It's a study done by Feeney in 1975. And what he discovered is that those plants that occupy, or let's say those plants that occur in, are what are referred to as late successional stage plants. They're plants that what Feeney called apparent plants. So since they're late successional stage, means that they are occurring at the very end of the succession of plants. And so since they're late stage, they're apparent, meaning that they're longer lived and they're going to be visible to potential herbivores. So in order to survive, late stage successional species or apparent plants are going to have to evolve what are called quantitative defenses. And but by this pathway, they're going to have to evolve ways to essentially deter specialist herbivores. And so by generating quantitative defenses, usually most of these are going to be carbon-rich sources. They're going to basically require them to generate a lot of energy or expense in order to manufacture these quantitative defenses. So they're trying to escape they're trying to deter specialist predators because they're apparent and they're more likely going to be able to be found by specialists. So they've got to put more energy into their quantitative defenses, which is going to be a highly specialized carbon-rich resin or other kind of material that prevents a specialist from feeding upon them. Other plants are early successional stage plants that are going to develop what are called qualitative defenses. That's going to be the better strategy for them because since they're unapparent versus apparent, being early successional stage plants, that means that they're going to escape predators or I should say they're going to escape herbivores in space and time because they're early successional stage, so they're only going to be prevalent during that early stage. They're not going to be found in the late successional stage soils. So they're not going to be prevalent like conifer trees would be in the late successional stages. So they're going to escape herbivores in space and time. They're going to develop qualitative defenses that allows them to basically be able to produce defenses that are not nearly as expensive as quantitative defenses are. And they're basically producing toxins that will work against generalist predators, which is more likely what they're going to encounter, in early successional stages. They're not going to encounter specialists, so they're not going to have to put as much into their toxic compounds since they're primarily escaping herbivores in space and time, since they're early successional plants. All right, other examples of plant defenses against herbivory, certainly the acacia tree, which produces or rather I should say, has a symbiotic relationship with ants. Usually these trees will produce what are called little Beltian bodies, which is a fruiting body that the ant will utilize primarily for food. That's what attracts the ants to the tree. And then, of course, the thorns is primarily the refuge that the ant is going to utilize for a home. So when any herbivore comes along and tries to consume the leaves, the ants are going to come out in mass and act kind of as a defensive mechanism. So this rather unique symbiotic relationship is one that gives the ant a home, and in turn the ant provides protection for the acacia tree. All right, moving on now to predator strategies. Just like if a prey can evolve a means to use color to escape predation, a predator can do the same thing. So here you have a praying mantis, South American praying mantis, that has evolved a similar color to the plant that it occupies as a sit-and-wait predator. So since it looks a lot like the flower, prey comes along thinking that, that's part of the flower, and the praying mantis now is going to be able to attack it and kill it and eat it. So this would be an example of what would be called aggressive mimicry, utilizing color, in this case, to camouflage yourself to gain access to prey. Another example of this aggressive mimicry would certainly be found in a number of vertebrate species, like the grouper here, which has got itself kind of somewhat buried in the substrate, waiting for another fish to come along, and then it will consume it. Another classic example of the aggressive mimicry would be the alligator snapping turtle. Utilizes a tongue which it can flick back and forth. Fish comes along, thinks that that's a worm or something, and then the fish will consume it, or rather, I should say, the turtle will consume it. We talked about the anglerfish. Remember when we discussed deep sea fishes? And I talked about its ability to have its own fishing rod complete with lure, which glows, and in that extreme dark environment of the deep ocean system, then by lighting that lure, it's going to attract other fishes, and obviously then it's going to consume them and be able to have adequate food in an environment where it's not going to be able to see anything because you're talking about total darkness. So these are all examples of the rather unique predator-prey relationship, and so I'm going to stop there. That completes that set of PowerPoint slides. So the next time that I have a discussion will be on the population interaction of parasitism, and then I'll ultimately get into a discussion of what's called mutualism. So that's where I'm going to stop.